Today I would like to explore a more focused issue on the historical timeline of the elimination of slavery, of abolitionism as a moral movement, let's say. I'm responding specifically to an interview that Alex O'Connor did with GB. Um, and yeah, I think he actually unknowingly, um, I'm not going to say spread misinformation, but he's definitely very uninformed on the matter, which kind of surprises me because he studied so much theology. Um, he's he asked kind of an open-ended, well, how can you say that it wasn't the Enlightenment that inspired the abolition of slavery? Like, why did Christianity wait until, the 1700s and 1800s to suddenly decide to abolish slavery? Um, does that not indicate that it was more an influence of the Enlightenment? Okay, that's a paraphrase of the argument he was making. And that's actually to me very disappointing because there's a very traceable timeline of the steady and gradual elimination of slavery in Europe, and that led the world on the matter entirely by centuries. Okay, and it was entirely inspired by Christianity. All right, so if you want to, like, the easiest thing is just to Wikipedia the matter. Wikipedia, the abolition of slavery in Europe. And what you'll see is a very um, unrelenting timeline where, from the very beginning in Christianity, the charitable treatment of slaves was demanded, and freeing slaves has always been an act of moral virtue in Christianity. All right, there were entire religious orders that kind of like the Buddhists will purchase animals and set them free, even today. There's been Christian orders that have been doing that for as long as Christianity in regards to slavery. Okay, now what you find is that by the Middle Ages, by 1000, there's virtually no tolerance for the enslavement of Christians. Um, of course, there are still slaves, but they tended to be Muslim, African. So it was still kind of seen as, like, spoils of war. You can, or debt. Um, but by the Middle Ages, throughout Europe, it was pretty much illegal for a Christian to enslave another Christian. It was certainly illegal to sell your children into slavery if you were a Christian, so on and so forth. And then what happens is, slowly and systematically, century by century, you see a rolling back of tolerance of slavery. I believe in the 1400s, French monarchy started outrightly banning slavery within France. England, the elimination of slavery amongst Christians in England was Middle Ages. I think there were some sticky things about, port cities, and there was kind of a tolerance of slavery amongst others, mainly Muslim, African. But the biggest kind of the beginning of the end of the tolerance of slavery actually came in the 1500s with several papal declarations that forbade transatlantic slavery. Now, they weren't in response to the transportation of Africans who were purchased already as slaves, then transported to the Americas. It was actually forbidding the enslavement of Native Americans. There were specific laws banning the forcible transport of Native Americans from the Americas to Europe, which was starting to occur, right? And there was a general idea, straight from the Pope, that the indigenous peoples of the Americas were fully human being and worthy of all dignity And they were some 50 to 100 million souls that needed to be brought to Christ. Okay? Now that seems kind of distasteful in our modern secular sensitivities, but the important part is that the church forbade the concept of conquer and enslave. Explicitly said, the Christian empires of Europe are not allowed to vanquish and enslave the indigenous peoples of North America. They must trade with them. They must proselytize them. They must educate them. They must include them in to the Christian societies that are going to be built in the Americas. Of course, the reality on the ground was, not nearly as pretty. But interestingly, and this is where, the real subtleties of history are shown, a couple of prominent clergy who were sent to or handling files from the New World actually encouraged the importation of African slaves in order to ensure that the Native Americans would not be enslaved. It's actually one of the reasons why the African transatlantic slave trade got going in the first place. But there was never an attitude like this was a good solution. Overall in the discussion was still this idea like eliminating slavery one day will be a good thing. But people in that day and age simply believed that the entire world would have to become Christian first. Okay? For them, Christian meant virtuous. It meant good. It meant monogamy. It meant abolition of slavery. And you can literally watch this in the history of Europe all the way back to the fall of the Roman Empire. You can define it as a battle between popes and the clergy and the powerful kings of Europe, where the Christianity, what we can now call the Roman Catholic Church, back then it was just the church, was saying the new covenant is the law. The new covenant is the moral law of Europe. Monogamy. Even kings are not allowed more than one wife. Of course, they had mistresses, but they didn't have concubines. And they didn't have multiple wives. People turned a blind eye because they're powerful, but popes were very, very firm. You will not publicly have more than one wife. Your children will be legitimate. There will be clear lineage of Christian rulers on all Christian lands. And lots of kings of Europe tried to push that. Ultimately, Henry VIII literally formed his own church so he could divorce and marry at will. Although he didn't go so far as to bring back polygamy for kings, right? And slavery was also in that same agenda. All right. Popes and clergy said slavery and monogamy, slavery will be abolished, and someday serfdom also, and monogamy will become culturally implemented in all of Christendom. So I really encourage Alex to look into this more, because the Enlightenment thinkers had frightfully little to say about slavery from a moral standpoint. If anything, they really just kind of took what the predominant attitude was and ran with it. And that predominant was African slaves were at the very, very bottom of the human social value hierarchy. And indeed, like even Rousseau literally and explicitly had the attitude of the indigenous peoples of the Americas were, noble savages who were still living in the Garden of Eden and living outside of original sin. And then, until Europeans showed up, right? Like the exact same worldview of the Catholic Church in the 1500s. Rousseau just took it and ran with it. Had no worry about black African slaves. They were not. They weren't Christian. They weren't white, right? But you cannot say that abolitionism and Christianity just popped up in the 1800s. You know, like Harriet Beecher Stowe one day decided to write a novel that insulted the sensibilities of all Southern Protestants. And abolition, you know, suddenly the Christian church decided it was interested in abolition. No, no, the Christianity has always taken on the cause of abolition. The question has always been is how long must it take? Even the southern U.S. slave apologists, including the founder fathers, except for a tiny fringe of hardcore Old Testament, Old Covenant, defenders, there was a general acknowledgement that slavery is bad. For now, we can't stop it, but someday we should. Right? Anyone who had a liberal or progressive mindset agreed that slavery would end. The question was the timeline and who should pay. Right? The Enlightenment guys were more likely to worry about the confiscation of private property, which was often presented as why we can't abolish right now. It's because, well, we can't do it because we can't compensate this private property, and the government, that would be a grave moral infringement on our, the liberty of private property, so on and so forth. It was the Christian abolitionists who were like, damn you and your excuses, this is immoral, end it now. Those same abolitionists were also global Christian missionaries. They still conflated that agenda. Monogamy and slavery was still conflated with the world eventually all becoming Christian. So that's my plea to Alex. No, abolition was most certainly a Christian agenda, and it's been a Christian agenda since the Roman Empire became Christian. The only debate is how incremental that was and should have been. Thanks for watching.